everyone. Well, welcome to this meeting of the Darwin Club for Social Science. It's our pleasure and privilege to have Samir Okasha here from the University of Bristol. Samir is well known for his theoretical work on multi-level selection, one of the most important scholars in this area. Samir, we're very much looking forward to your talk. I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for the invitation, and thank you for coming, everybody. The title of my talk today is The Evolution of Social Behavior, Kin Selection versus Multi-Level Selection. I've long been concerned with the question of what the relationship is between these two overarching frameworks for thinking about social evolution, the evolution of social behaviors, particularly pro-social behaviors. And this is work I did a few years ago now, but I still think about it as I don't think I quite got to the bottom of it then. Oh, whoops. Sorry, I did something wrong there.
You're still sharing your screen. You should have the slides up. There's the slides are back now.
Yeah, okay. It's just that. Oh, there we are. There we are. Now it's working. So the themes of my talk today are firstly, evolution of social behavior. Secondly, kin selection and inclusive fitness, ideas I'm sure all of you will be familiar with. Secondly, the idea of multi-level selection or group selection, a theoretical framework based around the idea that selection can work at more than one level of the biological hierarchy at the same time. And fourthly, a frequently made claim in recent literature that these two frameworks are in fact equivalent, despite having once been treated as rivals. That's a claim that I wish to scrutinize. And this will lead me on to the broader issue of causality and how to sort of make sense of the notion of causation in the context of social evolution models. Okay, so I'll start right at the very beginning with the by now familiar puzzle of altruism. So here we mean altruistic behavior in the biological sense of behavior that involves a sacrifice or in which the performer of the behavior incurs a cost and in order to benefit someone else. So then behaving altruistically reduces the actor's Darwinian fitness, their survival and reproduction, but increases that of a recipient. And on the face of it, of course, this is not what we would expect from a sort of basic appreciation of Darwinian principles, which lead us to expect that animals will behave in ways that benefit themselves, not others. And yet altruistic behavior is relatively common in nature. It's been found in almost all taxa in which people have looked for it. And so then this leads to the famous question of how altruism can evolve. How can the existence of altruism be squared with basic Darwinian principles? This is a familiar issue and was one that Darwin himself was well aware of. So to give some examples of the sorts of behaviors I have in mind, think of the well-known case of the vampire bat, much studied in the 80s, and then recently some more sophisticated investigations of the same system have confirmed the basic finding. So vampire bats need regular blood. They have to feed sort of 3 times a day in order not to starve. But many hunts are unsuccessful. And when they are, then other members will typically of the group will typically regurgitate blood to feed those who've been unsuccessful in their hunting endeavors that day. And this is then clearly an altruistic act, or at least it appears to be so. Think of honeybee colonies and other eusocial insects. So in these colonies, as I'm sure you all know, sterile workers that make up the vast number of the bees devote their whole lives to assisting the queen's reproduction. This seems to be then an extreme of altruism. Their own fitness is zero because they don't or can't reproduce. And instead, they devote their whole lives to boosting the fitness of the queen. And the same is true in many other eusocial insect species. Or to take an example from the microbial world, here's a species of Pseudomonas, bacterial species. Now, what these bacteria do in response to iron deficiency in their local environment is produce chemicals called siderophores that free up iron in the environment and make it available to bacterial metabolism. So the details of how this works don't matter too much. The key point to note is just that this is a public good. By producing these siderophores at an energetic cost to an individual bacterium, it benefits all others in the immediate vicinity because it's just released into the environment. So again, it raises the question, why do that? Why not just free ride on others' production of siderophores rather than going to the effort of making them yourself? Possible explanations of this phenomenon, then, the phenomenon of altruistic or pro-social behavior. Probably the best known one today is the framework that we call kin selection or inclusive fitness theory, closely bound up with the gene's eye view of evolution of Richard Dawkins. So this dates back in some ways to Darwin himself, and then was hinted at by Fisher in 1930. But it was really with the work of W.D. Hamilton in 1963 and 64 that the theory, although he didn't himself use the term kin selection, that the theory achieved its modern form. And the basic empirical prediction of this theory then is that organisms should be more likely to behave altruistically towards relatives than to non-relatives. Second possible explanation involves multi-level or group selection, the idea that selection acting not on individuals but on groups could lead to the evolution of altruism. This also goes back to Darwin, to his discussion in The Descent of Man, in particular in 1879, then was picked up by George Price in the early 70s, and by Hamilton, who became an advocate of this perspective too. And there's been, ever since that 1975 paper of Hamilton, there's been a sort of controversy about what the relation between these bodies of theory is. And that, for me, is a sort of quintessentially philosophical question. And that's why I think it's fair game for a philosopher of science like myself to try and analyze, because it doesn't, I mean, it's not the sort of question that can be directly resolved empirically, and nor theoretically, really. I mean, it involves questions about theory identity and about equivalence of apparently different frameworks that require us to use some of the machinery of philosophy of science, I think, to fully understand. So a little bit more about these two frameworks, first of all. So kin selection theory is widely taken in its qualitative predictions, at least, to be well confirmed, in that it correctly predicts that altruistic actions should be more commonly directed at relatives than non-relatives. Involves the distinction between the direct and the indirect fitness of an actor, the one who does the altruistic action. Its direct fitness is measured by its own number of offspring, its indirect fitness by a more complicated but its indirect fitness is its contribution to the reproductive success of its relatives, so or those who are the beneficiaries of the behavior. Kin selection then has a sort of individualistic orientation, in that in many ways the idea is to preserve the Darwinian idea that the individual is the adapted unit in evolution by sort of reconceiving or redefining what quantity it is that the individual organism is trying to maximize. So it's not its own number of offspring, but rather a more complicated measure, sometimes called its inclusive fitness, which takes account of the indirect component as well. This then is intimately bound up with the famous criterion RB greater than C for the spread of an allele or gene that causes a social behavior, where C is the cost of doing the behavior, B is the benefit conferred on someone else, and R is a measure of the degree of relatedness between the helper and the beneficiary. And is enjoyed, I think it's fair to say, striking empirical success. So that's not by no means to say that it can explain all aspects of social behavior. Indeed, I would say that it can't. Controversies surrounding kin selection theory have been present from the start. One concerns just how general it is. So some of its proponents say, look, it's as general as the theory of evolution itself. It just arises straightforwardly from applying Darwinian logic to social scenarios. However, the most explicit models of kin selection typically make restrictive assumptions, such as, for example, as additivity of costs and benefits, or the assumption of weak selection. So there is a debate then about the generality, which is very intimately linked to the second debate about what exactly the correct definitions of the relatedness coefficient, the benefit, and the cost are. Now, as we'll see, there are authors who've argued that one can, and some say should, define R, B, and C in such a way that the Hamilton rule is always true, right? So the theory achieves great generality. However, opponents have said, well, look, sure, that's to deprive the theory of its empirical content. Come back to this. Also related to the question when exactly this criterion for the spread of a social behavior or the gene causing the social behavior is actually valid. And this was the point of the famous critique now in 2009 by Martin Novak and colleagues who critiqued the ideas of kin selection and inclusive fitness. And then lastly, there's a question about when the doctrine of inclusive fitness maximization, that's to say the idea that it's reasonable to assume that organisms will be engaging in behaviors as if they were trying to maximize this quantity called inclusive fitness. When is that idea valid, that as if maximization hypothesis? Very attractive from the point of view of an economist, of course, because it makes it sound as if inclusive fitness is the utility function and the well-adapted organism is a rational utility maximizer, and that the insight of kin selection was to correctly define the utility function, to take account of relatives rather than just direct personal fitness. However, a substantial controversy concerns this issue of when exactly that inclusive fitness maximization result is valid. Proponents of kin selection have been somewhat cavalier on this point, I think it's fair to say. Okay. Multi-level selection theory, I think, can be traced to Darwin's discussion in The Descent of Man, although there are hints of it in The Origin of Species too, and deals with evolution in group-structured populations. So many biological populations involve a structure where a species is subdivided into groups of various sorts within which interactions take place. And this then gives rise to the notion that natural selection could take place at multiple levels at the same time. That's to say that a trait could be subject to individual level selection, but also group level selection at the same time. And the general criterion then for altruism to evolve, according to this theory, is that the between group component of selection must trump the within group component. The point being that within a group, altruism will be selected against as the selfish free riders outcompete the altruists. But at the group level, at the level of group on group competition, groups containing the nice guys, the altruists who look out for each other, might prosper over other groups. And so the overall evolution, direction of selection on the trait will depend on the balance between these two selective forces. We can illustrate that idea graphically as follows here, a very simple structured population model where one finds a number of individuals represented by the colored dots living in groups of some sort, where individuals are of two types, altruists and selfish ones, and where the basic idea then is that within any one group, the yellow ones are at a relative advantage, the selfish ones, but groups in which all or most of the individuals are selfish, are yellow, will do worse compared to groups where there are a high proportion of altruists. So the basic issue here was, and the suggestion of multi-level selection was nicely hinted at by Darwin in a sort of brief verbal discussion, of course, in the Descent of Man, where Darwin said, "He who was ready to sacrifice his life rather than betray his comrades would often leave no offspring to inherit his noble nature." So Darwin here is thinking about the evolution of pro-social sentiments among early hominids and is stating the puzzle of altruism. He's saying, well, look, the hominid who would have been prepared to sacrifice himself for his tribe, that would do worse. He would leave no offspring to inherit his noble nature. How then can such pro-social behaviors or sentiments evolve? Well, said Darwin, however, a tribe including many members who were always ready to sacrifice themselves for the common good would be victorious over most other tribes, and this would be natural selection. So here Darwin is pointing out that at the group level or the tribe level, selection might favor the very behavior that's disfavored at the individual within tribe level. Okay, brief history of the idea of multi-level selection or group selection. I mean, the notion of group level selection was accepted somewhat uncritically by many in the 1950s and 1960s, but was virulently attacked by George Williams in a 1966 book, and then criticized again by Dawkins in the 70s, drawing on the work of Hamilton, and by Maynard Smith in the 70s and many other places too, in 76 paper. The process of multi-level selection described by Darwin was in effect modeled by Price, George Price, in 1972, using the famous Price equation. And this work was picked up by Hamilton in 1975, who became an advocate of the theory of multi-level selection, as it was started to be called in the 1980s. Controversies. Well, one question is just how realistic it is empirically. I mean, so many evolutionists are inclined to say, look, sure, that's possible in principle, but we don't think it's particularly likely in practice to be a major evolutionary factor. A second controversy concerns the nature of the groups. So in that brief little description or proto-model of multi-level selection, I just said, suppose the individuals live in groups, but obvious question is, well, what are the nature of these groups? How are they formed? How long do they stick around? Relatedly, what's the source of the group structure? I mean, why is it that all organisms are structured into groups within which social interactions take place? Is it just because of limited dispersal, for example? Or is there some other reason? And then most crucially, perhaps of all, opponents or critics of multi-level selection have often said, look, it's all very well to explain what will happen if there is group variation between groups in respect of proportion of altruists in the group, but where does all that variation come from and why is it maintained? The question that I want to look at is what the relation is between kin and multi-level selection. Apparently they're quite different. I mean, they are framed in rather different ways. So kin selection focuses on relatedness and is very much an individual-centric or organism-centric theory. Multi-level selection focuses on hierarchy and is premised on the idea that it's a great mistake to think that natural selection operates exclusively at the individual level, that selection at other levels above and below that of the individual can be relevant too. So on the face of it, there's a clear sort of conceptual clash here. However, Hamilton 1975 saw a close link, as did Alan Graffen in 1980s. And there's a growing consensus in the literature today that these approaches not merely are not in competition with each other, but are actually equivalent, are different ways of saying the same thing or getting at the same thing. And some authors indeed have proposed translation manuals for going between the language of kin selection and that of multi-level selection. And others have embraced the idea that that these are perspectives rather than alternative causal hypotheses or mechanisms. So a word about that. I mean, how could they be equivalent? I mean, here are two heuristic ways of seeing the equivalence, or at least of seeing what people are getting at when they claim that there's an equivalence. Firstly, suppose that this is true. Suppose that social interactions take place in groups of some sort. And moreover, suppose, as is plausible, that groups are often composed of relatives. sort of extended families, if you like. Well, in that case, R, measuring the coefficient of relatedness between interactants, between performer of altruism and beneficiary, will be high because they're relatives. Donor and recipient are both relatives. And moreover, for the same reason, the between group variance will be high in phenotype and in fitness, because the groups are composed of reasonably close relatives. So they'll be internally more similar than if they were not. Second way of seeing the relational equivalence is this. I mean, suppose that we take heed of the following point, that in kin selection theory, despite the name, it doesn't really matter whether donor and recipient are related in the genealogical sense. What really matters is that there's a correlation between their phenotypes or their behaviors. So in short, the real criterion is that the beneficiary of altruism should have a higher than random chance of being an altruist themselves. And that one way of achieving that is indeed if they're genetic relatives or genealogical relatives, but that's not the only way. So arguably, the right definition of the relatedness term in kin selection and Hamilton's rule is as a more abstract measure of the correlation, the phenotypic or behavioral correlation between social partners. And once you notice that, then you immediately see that group structure could precisely give rise to such a correlation. If organisms interact not at random, but preferentially with others in their social group, then that could indeed be the source of a correlation and thus of high R. Okay. More precisely, here's the equivalence claim, or one version of it, spelled out a little bit more precisely. Consider a group-structured population, like the one I depicted before with those red and yellow dots. Suppose that the organisms are haploid, that there's no mutation at all, so genotype just is transmitted from parent to asexually produced offspring. And we suppose that either that meiosis is fair or that there's no, well, we shouldn't really say that. I mean, we don't need to have fair meiosis if we're assuming haploidy, obviously. So assume asexual reproduction, in short. Assume generations are non-overlapping and that we're measuring time discrete units corresponding to where a time unit corresponds to a generation. Consider then the fate of an allele which encodes the social behavior, right? The variable pi defined on all the individuals as taking the value 1 if the individual has the allele and so performs the social behavior, 0 otherwise. And we'll refer to pi as the character value of the ith individual. It's just an indicator variable for whether it is an altruist or not. And we'll let wi denote the reproductive output, the numbers of surviving offspring of that ith individual. So note then that I ranges over individuals in the global population without regard for group structure. We can then express the total evolutionary change, the change in the mean value of P in the whole population from one generation to another, where the mean value of P bar, P over bar, is simply the frequency of the altruistic gene or behavior in the overall population. We're interested in how that changes from one generation to another. And under the model assumptions we specified, that change is given to us by the simple price equation, which says that change is equal to the covariance between an individual's character, whether it's an altruist or not, and its number of offspring. So the covariance of W and P, I've suppressed the I index to make it more readable, all divided by the average fitness, W bar. It's just a normalizing constant here. So this really just enshrines the sort of basic neo-Darwinian idea that genes associated with higher fitness that correlate or covary with higher fitness will tend to spread in a population. Now, this little identity is always true under the assumptions given, but it's not always useful, in that the covariance term may, but need not, reflect a direct causal influence of an individual's character, that's to say whether it's an altruist or not, on its fitness. Here, as in any case in science, then as we all know, a positive correlation or covariance may or may not reflect a direct causal relationship between the variables. But once we start with this simple equation, we can represent the relation between kin and multi-level selection as alternatives ways of chopping up or partitioning that covariance term or decomposing it into two parts. We can either decompose it into within and between group components or into individual and social components, or direct and indirect components, if you like. The first is the methodology of multi-level selection, the second of kin selection. And so then this is a way of showing more precisely why it is that there's a case for saying that they're equivalent. They're just different ways of chopping up that covariance term. So we'll quickly run through how you do that chopping up, starting with the multi-level selection decomposition of the covariance. So here in this equation here, I've multiplied across by W bar. So that's the first term on the far left-hand side. But the thing we're really interested in again is delta P bar, the change in the frequency of altruism from one generation to another. And we now express it not in terms of the global covariance between W and P in the whole population and metapopulation of organisms, but as the sum of a between group component and a within group component, where the between group component is the covariance between the group means, and the within group component is the average across all the groups of the covariance within a group between individuals' character P and individual fitness W. And this then reflects the hierarchical nature of the selection process. I mean, the key point to note is that the term inside the expectation operator and the averaging operator on the right-hand side has the very same form as the first term itself. It's a covariance between fitness and genotype. And that's the sort of formal expression of the fact that one and the same sort of process, namely a process of natural selection, is taking place simultaneously between groups and within each group. And this then, as Hamilton said, appears to offer a formal separation of levels of selection. I say appears for good reason, though. The kin selection decomposition proceeds differently. And it again is the aim of this decomposition again is to chop up this simple covariance term, the simple price equation, into two components, reflecting the effect of an individual's behavior on its own offspring and the effect on social partners. And the idea is simply that we can write as a multiple linear regression the fitness of an individual as the dependent variable, where the two things it depends on in the regression are its own character value and the character value of its social partner. We assume it only has one social partner. So PI is the individual's own character value, again, one for an altruist, 0 for selfish. P prime I is the character of its social partner, again, 1 for an altruist, 0 for selfish. We then produce this regression equation where the beta terms are the partial regression coefficients measuring the effect of increasing the value of PI on WI while holding fixed the partner trait, and conversely, the effect of changing the partner trait on the fitness while holding fixed the individual's own character. And we can denote those regression coefficients as minus C and B in order to make a notational link with the famous Hamilton rule. And we can define the relatedness term of the Hamilton rule as the linear regression of P prime on P, that's to say a measure of the extent of correlation between social partners. And then with a few substitutions, we can produce an equation of this form. The total evolutionary change delta P prime P bar on the left-hand side is then expressed as the variance in P, in the individual character value, times this quantity minus C plus RB. Now, the variance, of course, can only be non-negative, and so we get the result that the gene spreads if and only if RB is greater than C. And we can write the same equation somewhat more explicitly as that. But here we partition the change into a direct effect and an indirect effect. And this then yields the always true version of Hamilton's rule. But advocated by these authors here, Dave Queller, Stephen Frank, Andy Gardner, and many others too. However, C and B here are defined as linear effects. So, I mean, which isn't exactly how one defines them in the original model that Hamilton and others were dealing with. So this is a sort of generalized Hamilton's rule, as it's sometimes called, in that it's always true. And R here becomes a measure of correlation and not a genealogical, not necessarily reflecting genealogy. Okay. So then this equivalence claim, the claim that multi-level selection and kin selection are equivalent, appearances notwithstanding, is made by a number of leading evolution theorists, including these ones. And I mean, I actually wrote this paper in 2015 or so originally, so I'm sure I could update this with many more recent references. That, however, it's denied by a number of other authors, typically who are saying only one of the two is any good. What then to make of this debate? Well, I think one thing we can say is this. I mean, it's clearly true that the total evolutionary change can be written either way, in terms of either of those partitions. Although in a way, I mean, I'll say as an aside that the kin selection approach is more general because it's applicable even when there aren't clearly discernible groups in the population. But leaving that point aside, I mean, this shows only the predictive equivalence, as I see it, of the theories, not their equivalence as causal representations or representations of the causal structure of what's going on in the world. And it's here that the philosophy starts becoming relevant. In that, I mean, I take it that evolutionary biology seeks causal explanations, like all sciences, or most sciences. It tries to tell us why certain things happened, why some things evolved and others didn't. Adaptation and natural selection, as I see it, are causal concepts. To say that there was selection for a gene means not just that the gene, correlated with fitness, but that it causally affected fitness and so spread. Now, the notion of causality is absent from the formalisms usually used to describe evolutionary change. So, so if you think of, say, basic population genetics models, for example, will have an explicit functional dependence of viability or survival on genotype. Now, they don't go on to say that, it's because an organism has the genotype it does that its viability or its expected viability is X rather than Y, but that's obviously implicit. And the causal interpretation is essential in order for the theories to give us insight into the world. So then the key question, as I see it, is this. I mean, are the circumstances in which one or other of these two partitioning schemes or decompositions, the kin selection one and the within group multi-level selection one, yield more causal insight into what the selection process? Or, as I gloss that, provide a more adequate causal representation of the evolution of a trait? Now, one response you might have when I ask this question is to say, well, look, I don't really know what you mean. I mean, I mean, that sounds sort of suggestive, but what does it really mean to start talking about an adequate causal representation? And what I want to do in the rest of the talk is to offer a sort of preliminary analysis of that notion and then extract some sort of tentative general conclusions about the circumstances in which kin selection and multi-level selection are causally preferable, respectively. And I'll offer you two illustrative cases that I think will help see the sort of thing I have in mind. Case one is an example that I call the non-social trait case. So suppose we're dealing with a trait, it could just be a physiological trait or an anatomical or morphological trait of an organism, such as, I don't know, say its height, for example, which affects fitness, but where there's no social component. Well, in this case, I say that the kin selection decomposition is appropriate causally, but the multi-level one isn't. And case two, I'm going to call the case of genotypic selection plus meiotic drive. I'll explain that in a moment. And I say in this case, it's the other way around. The multi-level selection formalism is causally appropriate, but the kin selection one isn't. In both cases, you can use either decomposition to divide up the total change. So you can represent or you can model the total change in either way. But if we're interested in having a model that captures the causal facts, then things are different. And I'll explain these two examples. Firstly, so suppose that P, our character or our gene, encodes a non-social trait, say an organism's height. It doesn't affect anyone else. But suppose it is a fitness relevant trait. Suppose, let's say, that taller organisms up to a certain amount at least are fitter than shorter ones for whatever reason. They have better survival or something, or they get more food. And now suppose that for whatever reason, the between group variance happens to be large. So the tall individuals are clustered in some groups and the short ones in others. There will therefore be a correlation or covariance between a group's fitness and a group's average height, obviously, because the tall, intrinsically fitter individuals are clustered in some groups. So those groups will do better than other ones. But in this case, it would be quite wrong to say, in my opinion, that there's a group level selection process going on. Rather, there's a process of individual level selection, a selection on the individual's organism's height. And a side effect of that is the correlation between the group means. And this ties in with what George Williams called the fortuitous group benefit, when he said, look, don't think that just because some group in nature has some attribute that benefits it, that reflects group selection. It could just be a side effect of individual selection. The group contains individuals who are intrinsically fitter or superior to other individuals. Now, kin selection and the non-social trait case, I think, gets it exactly right. The indirect effect is going to be zero. The trait spreads precisely because of its direct effect on individual fitness, captured by the -c term. That's to say, because of direct benefit to individuals. And that's intuitively the right thing to say. That's case one. Case two, consider this scheme. We think of diploid population genetics as a multi-level system, as is a lot of people do, where the groups are organisms and the individuals are the genes or alleles within the organism. And we consider one locus at a time as a standard in simple population genetics. And therefore, we have two levels of selection between organisms, because of their different genotypes, and between the alleles within a single heterozygotic organism, as occurs, for example, in meiotic drive. So suppose then we've got two alleles A and B at a locus. So three genotypes thought of as groups of two genes, AA, AB, and BB. Organisms with these three genotypes then have a different phenotype and thus potentially a different fitness. And suppose that the fitnesses are as follows. The fitness of AA homozygote is 16, of the BB homozygote is only 8, and of the AB heterozygote is 12. So a linear fitness scheme. And moreover, suppose that in the AB heterozygote, segregation is distorted in favor of the B allele in the ratio 2:1. So then we here seem to have two levels of selection: between group selection favoring the allele A, and within group selection in the heterozygote favoring allele B, and the overall change depends on both. And here I say the multi-level selection approach is intuitively causally adequate. But note well, you see that I've cherry-picked or jury-rigged the parameters of this model. So I've specified the exact segregation ratio in the heterozygote, deliberately chosen to engineer a simple fact, namely that the fitness of any allele is independent of its group context. So the fitness of an A is always 8, and the fitness of a B is always 4. So this then is a precise analog of case 1, the non-social trait case, in that the fitness of an allele depends only on its own type, whether it's A or B, not on whether it's in a homozygote or heterozygote. And this then is an analog of the non-social trait case. And yet here I say the multi-levels approach clearly gets it right. And so the moral then of that is that just looking at the fitness values alone without a sort of causal backstory about what's generating them is not enough to decide on the causal adequacy of one of our two candidate approaches. Kin selection approach to case 2 would represent the total change delta p bar as the sum of direct and indirect effects. But this is a highly artificial way to look at this case, because you see, if you consider an A allele in an AB organism, I mean, in reality, the allele's fitness, the number of copies it leaves in the next generation, depends on how well its organism does, how well that AB organism does, and on the share of the organism's fitness that accrues to it, which is set by the segregation ratio, by whether meiosis is fair or not. And those two things, 1 and 2, are ultimately determined by the pi and p prime I values, by the allele's own character, is it A or B, and but highly indirectly. So this brings me to the issue of causal adequacy. I suggest that a decomposition of our total change is causally adequate if and only if all character fitness correlations reflect the direct causal influence of the character on fitness. Now, there are two ways in which this criterion of causal adequacy can fail to be satisfied. One is if there's no causal influence at all, and the other is if there is a causal influence, but it's highly indirect, mediated by too many other variables. And intuitively, one is a more serious violation of causal adequacy than two. And we can illustrate these ideas usefully using causal graphs, where the two variables at the bottom of our graph will be an individual's fitness and its character, again, which is, remember, 1 or 0, depending on whether it's A or B, or A or S. The social partner's character will be P prime I, again, an indicator variable, 1 or 0. The group character, the average of all the individuals in the group, will be big PI, and the group's fitness, the average of the individual fitness, WI. So I, again, remember, indexes individuals in the global population without regard to group structure. And here we can depict the simple case where kin selection is adequate. So here we have the response variable, the individual fitness WI, has two causal arrows leading into it, one from an individual's own character and one from the character of its social partner. So how fit an individual is depends on its own character or phenotype or behavior, and also on who its social partner is and whether they give it any help or not. And those two, individual character and partner character, may correlate. The dotted line here indicating a correlation that's not directly the result of a causal relationship. Now, the non-social trait case, the case where we're dealing with height or something, when we get the spurious appearance of group selection, as judged by the covariance of the group means, can be depicted as follows. So here we have an individual's fitness, WI, halfway up the left-hand side of the diagram, and that's determined only by the individual's own character. That's the arrow that leads into it. Its partner's character determines the partner fitness. Then the individual and partner fitnesses determine the group fitness. The group could just contain the individual and the partner, groups of size 2, if you want. That's not essential. And similarly, the individual character and the partner character causally affect the group character. But crucially, there's no causal link between group fitness and group character. That's the signature feature of this, and shows you why the multi-level approach is flawed in this case. Now, here's the same diagram, but with social interaction added in, and that means we just add diagonal causal arrows from partner character to individual fitness and from individual character to partner fitness, like that. But still, only kin selection is causally adequate. Multi-level selection isn't, precisely because there's no causal link from group character to group fitness. They correlate, but only because of causal stuff going on at the lower individual level. Here's a case, though, where multi-level selection is causally adequate, and indeed where we have pure between group selection with no individual no within group selection component at all. So here we have an individual's character and its partner's character affecting the group character, which then affects the group fitness, and an individual's fitness is entirely determined by the group's fitness. If we add in a component of within group selection, then here what we've done is add a second variable in called share of group fitness that goes to individual I, and an arrow from that variable up to individual fitness. And so this then it gives expression to the following causal hypothesis, that the causal determinants of an individual's fitness are the fitness of its group and plus the share of that fitness that accrues to it in virtue of the allocation mechanism. So the key issue then in deciding whether the kin or multi-level selection approaches is causally adequate according to the analysis I've offered is this: is a group's fitness causally determined by the fitnesses of its constituent individuals or not? Or does an individual's fitness causally depend on the fitness of its host group? And both of these two hypotheses, which are really opposite ends of a continuum, in saying you could have something in between, are compatible with there being a definitional relationship between the fitness of a group and that of the individuals. The group's fitness, just by definition, is the fitness of the average fitness of the individuals in it. But that doesn't determine the direction of causal influence. Does the causal arrow go from individual fitness to group fitness, or vice versa? And that's another way of getting at the question of whether the group fitness is a mere aggregation of individual fitnesses or not. So here are the two structures of interest. Left-hand one, where the group's fitness is the causal upshot of individuals in the group having the fitnesses they do. And the second case on the right is where the group fitness is primary, if you like, and it causes the individuals to have the fitness they do, along with the allocation mechanism that determines how that group fitness gets parceled out. Empirical cases that correspond to these two scenarios consider the following sorts of case: a buffalo herd, a human hunter-gatherer tribe, a marine invertebrate colony like a bryozoan, for example, or a cellular slime mold, or a honeybee colony, or a multi-celled organism. Now, these different examples of groups involve different degrees of functional integration, different specialization, different modes of reproduction. And I suggest that the best case for kin selection is where you have extensive pro-social interactions, but individuals retain their autonomy and ability to reproduce, and where there's no group level functionality per se, and no division of labor, and no mechanism for repressing within group competition. All individuals can reproduce. One question is, does that apply to human groups? I would suggest that in many cases it does. And the best case for multi-level selection, by contrast, is where there is group functional organization, specialization of tasks, reproductive division of labor, repression of within-group competition, and where an individual's fitness depends on how well its group does. Now, even in that case, the kin selection approach is possible, but it's not going to be as natural in that it'll depict the ultimate the determinants of individual fitness will be variables that are causally too remote from it, and where the deeper causal understanding of why an individual has its fitness, the fitness level it does, will have to invoke the fitness of the group to which it belongs. Final observation I'll make is this, that kin selection can only fail to be causally adequate for the second, less serious reason. That's just, remember, there were two ways in which an approach could fail to be causally adequate according to my criterion. One is if it posits correlations between character and fitness that don't reflect causal relationships. And the other is if it posits correlations between character and fitness that reflect highly distant causal relationships. Kin selection can certainly fail to be adequate for that reason, but not for the first, because you see, ultimately, we're interested here in the change of in the change in the average value of an individual variable p, which is ultimately going to be determined by all of the individual character variables and the partner character variables. This brings us then to the broader issue of reductionism and the sense in which kin selection is a reductionist framework, for better or worse. Okay, so to quickly wrap up then, as I see it, the predictive equivalence of kin and multi-level selection as putative mechanisms or explanations of the evolution of altruism is fairly clear. However, predictive equivalence isn't equal to causal equivalence. I mean, the aim isn't just to write equations that get the allele frequency change correct, but also that offer insight into the causal structure of the selection process, which leads us to the criterion of causal adequacy. I've suggested a putative criterion and tried to illustrate that using the techniques from graphical causal models, the branch of computer science that many of you will know about, I'm sure, devoted to studying causal relationships in directed acyclic graphs. And the general sort of one-line result I get then is that kin selection is sometimes preferable and multi-level selection at other times, just as some a number of authors have come to for different reasons, but I hope to have offered you a sort of principle basis for that. Okay, and I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samir. That was fantastic, really stimulating. It sets out quite a new perspective on an old problem. Anyone like to ask any questions or make any comments? Please raise your hand. Marian, want to come in? Marian?
Yeah, just a sec. If I followed you correctly, Samir, this basically follows the argument in your article in the British Journal of Philosophy of Science, right? Like, it hasn't departed really a lot from that. Is that right? I can't hear you, Samir.
No, that's absolutely right, Marian. I was expanding that argument, not
okay. Well, I just a little couple preliminary questions. You've expanded a bit, and I want to ask you something. Are you still planning to write a book on fitness, or
yeah,
does this article?
No, absolutely.
This article didn't replace that.
No. Sorry, I didn't say expanded on the article. I said expounded the article.
Oh, okay. That's what I thought, because I didn't see any change. All right.
There isn't.
Okay. I found it persuasive that we need a causal understanding and not just a predictive one. And I thought that made sense to me. Any of the science that I know about in biology or in the social psychology, social sciences, we're looking for causal explanations. I don't know what they're doing in subatomic physics or astronomy or something, but in those sciences, that's. But the problem to me, it's not a problem to me, but I keep wondering if it may not be a problem to you. Might not in the future, some mathematician come along and say, hey, well, if the math that you're using doesn't do this causal analysis properly, then I'm going to do it properly. And here's math that will do it. Is that not conceivable sometime in the future?
I mean, I think that's right. And I mean, so you know, the sort of advocates or proselytizers for the use of causal graphical models precisely describe it as a sort of mathematical language for depicting causal relationships that has been absent, you know, particularly from statistics and the social sciences and econometrics, for example. They're often highly critical of, for essentially trying to talk about causal relationships using the language of statistical association and complicated schemes of, you know, conditioning on certain variables and so on to try and eliminate confounders and so on, rather than just being upfront and saying, look, let's just explicitly talk about causality as a, you know,
Okay,
as a
this is a
relation
literature I
between
don't know at all.
variables. So,
But you know, the diagrams with arrows and circles is not math to most mathematicians. Is there a mathematics version? And you
there
simplified
is.
it for us?
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, this stems from the use of something called path analysis that was designed by a guy called Sewell Wright, you know, who you'll know of, the biologist in the 1920s, and was then sort of rediscovered in the social sciences by people doing so-called structural equation modeling.
Okay, I know path analysis, yeah.
Right, and these are the antecedents of the modern work on causal modeling that I'm using. So I mean, the aim really is to think of the graph itself as a mathematical object, if you like. I mean, you know, you don't have to draw it exactly. You can think of it, you know, as a set of nodes and a set of arrows leading from one node to another. So you can write a description of it mathematically without drawing it, but it's much easier to draw it, right? And then, but in any case, whether you choose to draw it or just describe the structure of the, say, what the nodes are and which nodes have arrows leading into which, you think of that as a sort of formal mathematical object, and then that enables people who do this stuff to sort of prove theorems about it, to reason about it as a mathematical object. I mean, and it becomes non-trivial when you add in probability, you see, when you say there's a distribution of probability over the variables in the diagram corresponding to observations you might be able to make in a population, for example. And this, you know, so this work is, I mean, I think the work to look at here is by Judea Pearl in his 1996 book called Causality. And here's a framework that's pretty widely used, not really for the purposes that I'm using it. You see, it's usually used for causal inference, for working out what causes what in the real world. Whereas I'm using it for a more abstract goal, namely of trying to make sense of the idea that in a hierarchical or multi-level system, one can have causal arrows sometimes on the group or the higher level variables causally influencing each other, and other times it's all lower level. And that's a philosophical idea that you'll recognize from discussions of reductionism in philosophy of psychology and in other bits of philosophy of science. And what I'm trying to do here is to suggest that some of the techniques of the causal modeling approach can be usefully used to capture those philosophical ideas. So I'm not really using causal modeling for its intended purpose, if you like, which is very much epistemological, which is inferring what causes what and how you go about that. I'm sort of using it rather to address the more metaphysical question of what it means to have a causal relationship at one level rather than another level.
Okay, well, I won't take any more of your time. Thank you very much. I'll just throw in one more little thing. I have a new approach to the whole question of multi-level selection, which starts with ecology rather than social interactions, and then adds social interactions. But I'm in the middle of working on it now, so I'll send it to you sometime, see what you think.
I'd be very interested to see that, Marion. Thank you.
Thank you both. Jan Willem.
Yes, thank you very much for that. That was really wonderful. My sort of question / comment relates to little bit back to your discussion previously, where you were talking about what mathematics can and cannot do, and whether it can do causality. I've always understood, and I'm not very deep into this mathematics. A colleague of mine, Matthijs van Velen, he's a mathematician, and he says they're not mathematically equivalent. I'm not sure if he's published this work. He was working on it recently. So there are discussions among mathematicians where they say it's not functionally equivalent. But more generally, my understanding of these equations is very much in terms of analytical statements that are always true. You know, they're stating an equivalence, and then so once we are doing theory development, whether it's in economics or management, which is where I am, or whether it's anywhere else, then yes, your sort of questions come to the fore. What can we really say that is causal? And I think by itself these equations cannot do that, which I think was your point. But now I come to my question. What strikes me, what has always struck me in the discussions around these various equations is that it all ultimately seems to go down to how we understand the R, the interrelatedness, and in some sense, isn't it the case that when we use this sort of thinking to actually start theorizing in causal terms, that what we're doing is theorizing about the nature of R, and the part of the nature of R could be how individuals are interdependent. And part of it could be more of an ontological question, whether or not there is another level of analysis. So it's not just, so for me, the question is, how do you get from the math to the theorizing, which I think is exactly your point. And my intuition is that the theorizing would be about how in the real world R as a general measure of interdependence among interacting organisms works. And this can take many forms. So that's where the theorizing would come in. How do we understand the interdependence in a causal way? But on top of that, maybe the ontological question of these levels of analysis. So for instance, and then I'll shut up, your example with the tall organisms, and that was your example for kin selection. At some point in the example, you were saying, okay, now let us assume that the taller ones cluster in specific groups and the smaller ones clusters in other groups. But why that is the case, where this clustering comes from, would then, I suppose, would have to be part of the causal theory. Sorry, I'm not sure if that was clear enough, but
yeah, very, very clear. So you cover quite a lot of different points there. So I'll try and go through them. So yeah, I mean, you mentioned Matthijs van Velen's work, which I know well. I've discussed this stuff with Matthijs a few times. I mean, I actually think he's right. You see, and there's not really any conflict between what he says and what I'm saying, because
good.
I mean,
I don't understand the math enough to
okay,
pass judgment.
no,
So I'm glad you say that.
He's made some very good points. Yeah, I mean, and he's entirely right that in a certain sense that these are not equivalent mathematically, but that's because he's for good reason using he's not employing the sort of most general of all definition of R, B, and C in the formulation of kin selection that he's dealing with, because he's sort of rightly thinking, well, that's just to to distort the original meaning of the theory of kin selection. I mean, so essentially the sort of starting point I was taking was, well, one certainly can establish equivalence in a fully general setting if one is prepared to define things precisely so as to engender that result. Now, whether that's a good thing to do or is an insightful thing to do, or just a way of depriving the theory of any of whatever empirical content it had, is a separate debate. But I was sort of taking it for granted you can do that if you want. Whether it's a good thing to do, again, different question. But then I was saying, well, let's ask the question, have you succeeded in capturing causality plausibly? And if not, why not? Once you've done that, what Matthias is doing is sort of not granting the first stage of that. He's saying, look, I don't want to do that. I want to, I don't want to accept the equivalence or the definitions of the relatedness terms and the B and C terms, which are needed to generate this equivalence. And you see, I mean, it really comes down to, in part, well, it comes down to a number of things, but one of them is whether you want the cost and benefit terms to be frequency dependent, to be functions of the frequency of the behavior in the population or not. Because intuitively not. If I'm an organism deliberating and I think to myself, okay, well, if I share my food, then I'll, increase my risk of survival by X, and I'll benefit my relative by Y. And so the X and the Y then are meant to be sort of properties of the interaction, if you like, just of me and the putative person I might help. And shouldn't change every generation as the population evolves, right? But if you define R, B, and C in these very general terms by this linear regression procedure that I was talking about, then you don't have that. And in fact, we can derive a criterion for the one generation change, but then we have to, the next generation, the values of those coefficients will all be different. And so in a way that the theory loses much of what made it appealing, in that it ceases to be possible to think of the B and the C as sort of things that an individual might try to or of the inclusive fitness as a quantity that the individual might try and alter by means of its own behavior, because we've defined it in such a way that it doesn't just depend on its own behavior. And moreover, the criterion R, B greater than C might be satisfied in generation 1, not in generation 4, despite nothing having changed except the spread of the gene in the population, which is pretty weird. So for those are the sorts of reasons that lead Matthias and others not to want to adopt the fully general formulation of kin selection theory. So that's that. I mean, I think you're absolutely right when you say, well, why is it that the organisms cluster this way? Yeah, that's perfectly true. But again, that's a slightly different point. I mean, I was just sort of making the simple argument. Let's say that they do for whatever reason, and that allows us to compute the next generation, the evolutionary change over one generation, but no more. And then let's ask about how to causally describe what just happened. But of course, you're absolutely right. There is this deeper question about why organisms are sought with each other at all. And crucially, and you see, that was one of the very objections to the group selection mechanism that people rightly pointed out. They said, well, wait a minute, why are the groups so internally homogeneous but distinct from each other? Where did all that structure come from? Or to phrase it slightly differently, if you say, well, let's suppose that altruists tend to mate with and assort with other altruists preferentially. Again, so there's a non-random pattern of assortation or mating in the population or behavioral interaction. Why is that? I mean, again, and these are certainly valid points. So yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you about that. Having said that, I do think that there's a real case for saying that you should understand the relatedness coefficient as a general correlation measure of some sort. I mean, whatever exactly its mathematical definition may depend on what you want it to do, but rather than as a measure of genealogy, because in its original interpretation, then it was meant to be a half for parent and offspring, half for full siblings, a quarter for parent and grandchild, etc. And that made intuitive sense and allowed us to sort of extract a simple testable prediction from the theory. Organisms should be nicer to their offspring than their grand offspring, for example. However, it also misled a lot of people into thinking that kin selection theory was ultimately depended on something to do with genealogy, which it really didn't. and genealogy was only a proximal way of generating the correlation between donor and recipient. And I think that point was not understood by a lot of people for a long time. So what, I mean, I think the move to the more general definition of R, I think, is valid.
Samir,
Lots more to say about this.
Unshare your screen.
Thank you.
Yeah, unshare my screen.
Yeah,
stop sharing. Got it. There we are.
Thank you. That's great. Fanish.
Hi, Samir. That's an amazing talk. I really learned a lot in the 1 hour. I had one question of clarification and then one kind of suggestion. So the clarification question is, my understanding of causal graphs is it's not at all controversial to state that completely different causal graphs can produce the same structure of correlation in the observed data.
Yep.
In fact, that was the whole purpose of causal graphs, to disentangle that sort of statement, right?
Yeah.
So can I not interpret your exercise as one saying that very different causal graphs are in fact compatible with the same predicted pattern of covariances and correlations between observed data? In which case, there's nothing in the least controversial, I think, about the claim you're making. Is that correct, firstly? I mean, just from a purely statistical point of view, if you set aside the context specificity of anchoring this in biology, that's the higher level claim you are making. Is that correct?
I think, I mean, it's certainly the first thing you say is unquestionably true, that different causal structures or causal graphs can induce the same patterns of association between the variables. And so, yeah, although you see, I mean, the claim that the causal graph people often make is that from a knowledge of the observed distribution over the variables, then one can uniquely identify the underlying causal graph, so long as certain assumptions are met.
Exactly, only under some assumptions. Yeah, at least the Peirce framework is always very assumption heavy. You can't do assumptions.
Yeah, I mean, and they tend to sort of downplay them. So I mean, the critical assumption is the one that they call faithfulness, and that basically says that causal. It's not the case that they want to say you can't have this. You've got one variable here linked up by two distinct causal paths to a second variable, and the strength of the causal influence exactly cancels out. Because then you could never infer anything about anything if you were allowed to posit that, hidden stuff of that sort. But whether what I'm doing is controversial from the point of view of causal graphs, or whether it's just an instance of a well-known point, I would say not just an instance of a well-known approach, in that I'm sort of using the framework for a different question, really. So the question I'm trying to address is, when is this scientific framework a good one, and when is it possible to do the analysis in those terms, but it's not a good one? And I take that to mean, when is a direct causal link between the fitnesses and the phenotypic variables, and when is it highly indirect, or they're joint effects of a common cause or something, or no causal link at all? So I don't think that what I'm saying is directly just a special case of the observation that one and the same pattern in the data can be produced by two different causal structures. I don't think it's just that point, although that point is certainly true.
So maybe my suggestion has something to push further in this direction, which is the precise pattern of linkages between individual fitness and group fitness, the different causal arrows you've drawn. Could those vary by species?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So it's just at the weekend, actually, chatting with a guy who works on mongooses, on these little mammals that live underground and highly social, form sort of colonies. And he had read my paper, and he was saying, in that species, he thinks the group fitness causally affecting individual fitness is sort of exactly right, because he's saying that, you know, how well the group does as a whole, depends on, you know, features of the group and how well the organisms all get on and stuff, and how successful they are at evading attack by other groups. And those are all group level features. And then there is indeed, at least the way they represent it, a sort of mechanism or parameter that determines how the group's payoff is divided among them all. So I think that's a case where there is a causal arrow from group fitness to individual fitness. But in other cases, I think it'll be very different. And I think, you know, in many cases, the right way to think about it will be, you know, if you think of, I don't know, a buffalo herd or something like that, where they don't really interact that much with each other. Then if we ask the question, you know, what causally influences the individual's fitness, then it'll be what, you know, its own attributes largely. And if we ask the question, well, what makes it the case that the group has the fitness that it does, the answer will be because of all the individuals within it have the fitness that they do. So in that case, the causal arrow will be from the individual's fitness to the group fitness. But I do, like I say, think of those as opposite ends of a continuum, and there'll probably be a lot of stuff in between where there's.
Okay, thank you both. I'd like to fit in a final question from Pavel. Pavel?
Yes.
Hi.
Hi. I just wonder, I was trying to solve the problem of multi-level selection myself and found that it's simplified very much if you don't put individual in the center. Although I'm in economics, I'm very much individual as a methodologist in this. I believe that you must put in the center the whole groups, and each group has its own attention from actors to the genomic instructions, or whatever you would call it, by which they are programmed. And they are programmed including programming of their individuals. And then you don't ask question like why an ant is sacrificing itself. The ant doesn't think about it. It's just programmed to not to think about it. It's just programmed to do certain things, to belong or build, make its contribution to the building of the anthill. So this is as natural selection goes from individual cells through multicellular organism already there. The point is to make cells such that they can cooperate it with other cells, and eventually you get the genomic recipe for the entire anthill, for instance. But then the receptor must provide such individuals that fit the anthill. So if you go from genomic effects of what maybe something like Dawkins did by turning attention from actors to what I would call the genomes. So what's selected is the genomes, is a recipe for making functioning fit structures, which may be one level or several levels, and if the structures are of several levels, then the basic recipe or instructions must provide for all the for all the levels that the complex structures contains, to make enough of individuals or enough of pieces with enough of good properties that allow to make a successful large group. So that forget individuals as special kind of actors, and 10 of how to make one or several level structures and what you need to give them as basic instructions to build such a hierarchy. It's about, I have difficulties explaining to make people understand who are, so if you may accept this very imperfect hint, forget individuals and tend to instructions for building hierarchies with possibly several levels of individuals of different levels.
Samir.
This is about all I can say shortly.
Okay,
Thank you, Pavel.
Thank you, Pavel. I'm not quite sure if I agree with you or not. I mean, you see, when you say forget individuals, you don't mean instead put the group at the center. You mean rather put the strategy or the behavior or the trait at the center, or the gene, if you like. Is that right?
Not quite. You put in the center, final center is the entire group, and consider all the pieces of which the group is made of possibly several levels. And the group has some basic instructions for being self-organized through several levels of the acting melon.
I mean, I think there are biological systems for which that sort of description resonates and you know makes sense. But I mean, one thing is that we're interested often in the question of how they got there in the first place. So we don't want just to take as a sort of starting point the existence of a sort of cohesive group, in that many of these theories are in a way attempts to explain the origin of such phenomena.
If we are Darwinian, then we must say by chance and necessity. That is, if there's an individual ants or some insects, if they by chance got in their genomes ability to cooperate with their neighbors and started to build by chance anthills, which proved successful. So this is it. It's the trial and error. You can, as a Darwinian, you don't always ask for causes. You just admit that something happens, like the emergence of multicellular organism 3 billion years ago. This was certainly a chance that they were tried several times and never succeeded. So, like the evolution of the genomes.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time.
Okay, so this is all.
Can I give Samir the last word on this, please?
A long story. There's lots to say about this. I mean, I should perhaps just say one thing that I maybe should have said in response to early questions. I mean, another thing that I'm doing differently from the usual usage of causal graphs is that I'm including in the causal graph variables that are just purely mathematical functions of other variables also in the graph, right? So I'm dealing with a situation where the fitness of the group just is definitionally related to the fitness of all of the individuals in it, is fixed by those. And now there's no bar on doing that in standard causal graph theory, but nor is it a normal thing to do, in that it seems sort of unparsimonious. You know, if you've got two variables, then you don't normally define a third variable as the sum of those first two and also include that in the model. So that's another aspect in which I've sort of deviated from orthodoxy in my setup. But again, because my goal is somewhat different from those of most people who use this framework.
Yeah. Most of you are
thanks very much. Pavel, we're running out of time, sorry. Thanks very much indeed, Samir. You provoked a very, very interesting discussion. From my point of view, I was really enlightened by at least the second half of your talk, which really posed some very, very interesting questions. And emphasize the issue of causality, which I think is, I agree with you, is central. So thank you very much for coming to the club and enlightening us about this. It's a great pleasure to have you. If you want to come to future meetings, you'll be very welcome.
Well, thanks.
Sure.
No, I certainly would like to have that option. Yeah, and if anyone wants to email me, then by all means, please do. I'll be happy to continue the discussion.
Yeah, thanks again. It's unfortunately we do have to cut it short, but
sure, yeah.
I really appreciate your contribution, and also of everyone else who's contributed to this session. So thank you, everybody. On that note, I'll say goodbye.
Bye.